The East Baton Rouge Parish Library believes that a thriving business community is good for us all. That's why we help entrepreneurs start businesses with tools like Gale Business Builder. Keep commerce rolling by providing access to computers, printers, and free Wi-Fi at 14 branch locations. Get a library card. Grow your business at ebrpl.com/business.
Started making beer at home and immediately fell in love with it. After like the day of my first batch of brewing, I was already thinking, can I do this for a living?
Oh yeah, obsessed with it. He was totally consumed by it, and then looked at me one day and told me I was put on this earth to brew beer. And I was like, wow, that is such a bold statement. And if you can say that about anything, then you need to follow your dream and do it.
Good morning and welcome to Strictly Business. I'm your host, Penny Font. This webcast features conversations with Louisiana's most influential CEOs, entrepreneurs, and community leaders, with the goal of providing insights, ideas, and inspiration to help you and your business grow. We want to keep Strictly Business as interactive as possible. So for those joining us live, here's an icebreaker question for you. Submit your vote in the comments, and the results will be posted at the end of the broadcast. Strictly Business is brought to you by the East Baton Rouge Parish Library and Home Bank. Without their support, this project would not be possible. This month, we're talking with Dr. Greene about leading in times of crisis, which he has done in a variety of roles. He is currently serving his 6th year on the Louisiana Public Service Commission, regulating Louisiana's utilities at a time when the state is grappling with growing threats to its power grid, as well as soaring costs for business and consumers alike. He's also an orthopedic surgeon at the Baton Rouge Orthopedic Clinic and formerly served as chief of surgery at Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Center. He is a veteran of the United States Navy Reserves, where he served as a commander. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Greene served on the Louisiana Legislative Advisory Task Force on Economic Recovery, and through his foundation, he is focused on humanitarian aid and disaster relief throughout the world. Dr. Greene, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us. It would seem that you spent a fair amount of your lifetime thus far navigating a crisis, whether it be a health crisis that a patient is facing, perhaps a crisis as a commander of the U.S. Navy Reserves during times of disaster, or a humanitarian crisis, or even in your role on the Public Service Commission or the Advisory Task Force during COVID. Share with us one of the most challenging professional crises you have faced and how, as a leader, you have navigated that.
I would say that probably the toughest one was when 2010. It was when the earthquake hit Haiti, and I got asked to round up some teams and go there, and it was very abrupt. It was very high intensity, and we had to it was demanding of resources, both talent from surgeons and also equipment in a very rural area of Haiti. So that was probably the hardest, but we learned a lot in doing it. And what I did learn is that pretty much every day of my life leading up to that moment had led to being ready for that without knowing what it was I was going to be prepared for. I did a trauma fellowship within orthopedics, and I was involved in some humanitarian things leading up to that. And so it was neat that you could look back afterwards and go, I never knew that was going to be what I was preparing myself for, but I look back at my life and I could see that my whole path had led to that moment, and I was ready for it.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you. Many in the business community might say there's a crisis of sorts in our power grid in terms of stability, resilience, security, and cost to the end user. What ways do you see companies being impacted by the energy structure that we have in Louisiana? And as a leader on the Public Service Commission, how are you pushing to have those issues addressed?
Well, I think they're right. And what happens is we get a stress like a hurricane, and we figure out what the weak points are. We're doing a couple things we're looking to see how can we do that better to where we can survive the stressors when they occur. It's not if they occur, it's when they occur. Now, the problem is that could be pretty expensive. I mean, if we had to start from scratch, I think the best would be small stackable nuclear and underground microgrids. But for us to go from where we are now to that would probably be $100 billion. So we're always asking what's the best in combination with what's the cheapest, and somewhere in there trying to find the right answer. And we get a lot of inputs, of course, from utilities, from consumers. And so we're just trying to outline that right now. For the business perspective, it's lost wages, lost business, lost opportunities. And we have such rich resources here in Louisiana, the river, the people, our agriculture. If we could have the ideal energy structure and the ideal transportation structure, I think we could attract a whole lot more business. Again, it's how do we pay for that? Because we're also per capita the poorest state in the union. And so part of it is, if you build it, will they come? And then the other part is, well, maybe they could be part of the solution in building it, but it's hard for that to be a bait to get companies to come. If you build a power grid, we'll give you a spot here. So we kind of need to do that ahead of time, I think, in order to attract more businesses and get the ones that are leaving to stay.
Absolutely. Some great insights there. Are there any trends or regulatory or policy changes on the horizon that could impact the future of electricity pricing and grid stability in Louisiana?
Yeah, we're looking heavily at how Florida rearranged their resiliency and hardening in both 06 and in 19. And they've had a number of named storms, but they've performed better than we have. They also put a lot of money into their grid. And so back to what our efforts are, we're trying to make it as good as possible, but for as cheap as possible. And so that's not a 5-minute conversation. We're in the throes of that right now. And I think something good will come out of it. But I also think that what's hard in government is people often expect, like, we decided something and it's either right or wrong for the rest of time. And what we really need to do is, after the next couple of hurricanes, can we make it iterative? Okay, how can we make that better? What did we not see? It's just not popular for politicians to say, "Oh wait, we were wrong. We shouldn't have done that. Let's now adjust," which is what we should do. So I do think it'll be iterative as it gets tested each time, but it has to be stronger than it is now.
We look forward to seeing where things go with that. Can you provide an example of a difficult decision you had to make as chairman or a member of the Public Service Commission during your tenure that has had significant impact on the state's response to a crisis?
Well, there's one in particular, and what I try to do, I'm a right-leaning centrist, a Republican, but I try to leave the R's and the D's at the door and approach the problem in a problem-solving manner. And I'll never forget when it was probably early on, one of my second meeting or third meeting ever, it was a vote to deregulate trucking. And in trucking, hazardous waste trucking in Louisiana had always been like the taxi cab medallions in New York City. If you had one, you were golden, and if you didn't, you weren't. And so by deregulating it, we were going to make it more competitive. Now, I tell people I do a really good hip and knee replacement because I've got 5 or 6 partners that do as well. And I think competition breeds excellence. And so how can we, and so we did that with trucking, and we made it, okay, you have to be safe and fair and here, but anybody can do it. And the quality went up and the price came down. And so, that was it seemed like a difficult decision, but once I got all the facts in front of me, it wasn't. It was clear that's what we needed to do. It was a 3-2 vote, but guess what? The quality's gone up and the price has gone down. So we're looking for other ways, either competition or competition-like, that we could have, that the participants in the energy space in Louisiana could have some skin in the game. Because right now, they make a lot of money here, but they're kind of like the owners of NFL teams. They privatize the gain and socialize the risk. If the Saints want a new stadium, who pays for it? The taxpayers. But who makes all the profits? The owners. And that's kind of what that happens in the utility space too. And so what we want is, look, we don't mind you making money, but you need to have some risk here too. Not We can't, as ratepayers, the poorest state in the union, can't have all the risk.
Absolutely. Appreciate those insights. What are some key principles of leadership that you believe are essential when navigating a crisis situation?
Yeah, I think I wrote down some. I think it's important to seek the truth. One of the things I try to do in any topic we're discussing, whether it's a crisis or a long term, is get as much data as possible. And then secondly is demonstrate empathy. It tends to be, what people tend to do is to say, hey, this is right because this is what I've decided on. But if you could put yourself in the other people's shoes, what matters most to them in this situation, let that factor in. It doesn't have to be the driving force, but let it factor in. But so seek truth, demonstrate empathy, and then lastly, be courageous. It's not gonna be easy to make those decisions, but if you do them in that order, then I think people will respect you. I know when I make a decision, we pretty much write a brief, say this is why I decided what I decided, and not just this is what I was told to because I'm a Republican, right? It's let's find out the right answers, and then be empathetic about it, but then be courageous enough to make that decision.
I want to ask a quick follow-up question. Do you find, sort of in today's climate, it's sometimes difficult to get at the truth? That being step one.
I think part of that problem is there's so much data. I think about the book that we were introduced to in business school called How to Lie with Statistics. What they say, 78.25% of all statistics are made up on the spot. The volume of data out there, you can kind of find whatever data you want to support whatever you already have in mind. And so that's confirmation bias or cognitive dissonance, is when you don't let new information in order to protect the opinion you already have. So I keep those high on my radar. I don't want to have confirmation bias, and I don't want to have cognitive dissonance. And I have a team that helps with this. How can we rely on the source of that information? Because is the person feeding us that source, is that beneficial to them that they give us that information? So fortunately, we can do that, trust and verify the information that we get.
Great, thank you. In your opinion, what distinguishes effective crisis leadership from regular crisis leadership?
I think about Dan Crenshaw as a congressman, and one of his quotes, he was a Navy SEAL, is that he says, "You're not going to out-calm me." And he was a Navy SEAL, so all this is, it's shots fired, but it's just verbal shots. He's had the actual ones. And so I think it's important to be calm, take a step back. And if you go through those three things I just said, like seek the truth and know that at the end of it, you're still going to have to be courageous. I think that's probably, because if you get flustered or disoriented in the crisis, it's the probability of landing well, not just for the leader, but for the organization, is going to be very poor. So oftentimes that means, like, can you, in the midst of the crisis, find a way to visualize it from above or throughout time, or, what's the best and worst that could happen? What are we trying to accomplish? Just go through some very basic, back to the basic things about how are we going to get out of this? What was our goal to get out of this? There's also the idea of never waste a good crisis, right? There's times where you want to change things, and sometimes the best time to change them is in the middle of a crisis. So, absolutely. And I did a trauma fellowship, so it was, pelvis fracture after pelvis fracture, and then a femur fracture, and then to the people that was occurring to, it was a very big deal, but to me, it was sort of routine. And so I also think about when I was growing up, my mom used to tell me I would be enduring a crisis of my own in 10th grade or 11th grade. And oh, you're building character. And I would say, I don't want to build any more character, because I only need more character for the next thing that's going to be harder. But to realize, that's part of, you've been prepared your whole life for this. If you made it to that spot in leadership, it's not because you haven't handled a crisis, it's because you've handled it well. but the next one might be a bigger crisis than you've ever handled in the past. So get ready. You're going to build more character.
I love that story about your mother. Are there other people who have inspired you in crisis leadership?
Yeah, my dad was a state senator and he ran for governor in '99. And he would always say, look, just gather. First of all, when you get into politics, and there's politics in private businesses as well. I mean, office politics, I'm not as good at, but in all forms of politics, if you can just gather information, seek wisdom, as much information as possible. Always pray for wisdom. The Bible says if you pray for it, God will give it to you. And then have that courage to make a decision, knowing that you're going to upset some people. Somebody told my dad before he got into politics, look, before you get into this, look around and see who your friends are. Because when you get spit out of it, that's who your friends are going to be. This is not a friend gaining experience. This is a leadership role to make society to the next round if we can keep going. And so my dad and my mom have both inspired me a lot. And then I've had great mentors in the healthcare space that I remember one of my mentors in Texas, there was an ice storm and we had about 45 old people with hip fractures. And he was a trauma guy. He was super calm. And I went to him, I said, I got 45 hip fractures coming. He goes, well, we better get started. And he didn't overreact or what do we do? Or just like, let's just get after it. And so that's kind of a way I approach it.
That's wonderful. How did your background, you just mentioned an example of this, but how did your background in orthopedic surgery and your military experience in the U.S. Navy Reserves kind of influence your approach to crisis leadership?
I hope it does a lot. As a trauma surgeon, as in healthcare in general, there are a lot of parallels, but they don't really cross to the energy regulatory space. It's highly regulated, constantly changing, and pretty expensive. And so I live in that world all day. And so a lot of it makes sense. I think the benefit that I can bring is I don't have a dog in the fight in the energy space. I don't have a company that I own. I consider myself a regular person who happens to be serving in this role. And I always think about the single mothers out there that are living in a remote part of town that don't even know these meetings happen. It should be with them in mind that I'm making these decisions, as well as everyone else. And so I think and then with trauma, that helps. That helped a lot when there was a hurricane, because it was okay. What are our principles that we do when someone comes in after a high-speed motor vehicle accident? We go through the checklist. Or is there a similar thing we can do here? What's most important? How do we get the hospitals back on? How do we get substations back running? Like if we go through it methodically and not let it rattle us outside of our decision-making space.
Absolutely. How important is collaboration and communication among leaders during a crisis? And can you share any strategies for fostering effective collaboration?
Yeah, I think collaboration is everything. Even in politics, there's 5 of us on the commission, and I get along well with everybody. I think that we should be an idea meritocracy, and meaning, look, whoever's got the best idea, let's test that and see if it works. And so I think it's important to us, and the R&D part of it gets hyped up on social media, and that's created a lot of division. But I mean, I've helped out my friends on the other side of the aisle with their healthcare stuff, sometimes with their elections, and it can be harder sometimes to navigate the collaboration within your own party. So we're trying to work on that too. I think that's super important. Part of me says, I think George Washington was right. We just don't form political parties. And we got far off from that. But I think collaboration is key. It's trying to find back to being empathetic. I think the core of collaboration is empathy. Like, where can we find common ground? And it may not be everything I want and everything you want, but can we make it better than it is now? And then the second thing to that is, my dad used to always tell me, there's no limit to the amount of good a person can do if they don't care who gets the credit. So if we're going to collaborate, look, it doesn't have to be my name on it. It can be yours. If that's the main thing for you, I'm gonna be empathetic. If that's the main thing for you, then okay. But can we get it a more refined answer?
Absolutely. So, in the moment, as a leader, how do you balance the need for quick decision making with the necessity of considering long-term consequences during a crisis?
Well, in surgery, we can't let's say that we get into some bleeding. We can't say let's go research bleeding for 3 days. I mean, the patient will die. You have to be able to, based on your knowledge of the situation and your instinct and what you think the right thing to do is, stop the bleeding. And so I think it's important, and that's where it is different for me. I did a couple joint replacements this morning, and then I come and I do politics. And so when I do that joint replacement, within an hour, the course of their life has changed, and I can pretty much prognosticate what's going to happen at 1 month, at 3 months, at 6 months, a year, and we're changing the course of their life. In politics, in policy, I would say that's more difficult because we think we know what's going to happen, but do we have the humility and wisdom to adjust after 9 holes? Like, when we get along the way, say, wait, we should have done that differently. So it is different. I think there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and I highly recommend it. There's pathways in our brain, and we need to realize when sometimes we'll have a situation that it's better for us to think through it rather than just respond. Like the whole thing of don't press send. Let's say someone really irritates me on an email or in person. If I just react, that's not going to be good. We're just going to fuel the fire. I need to think through that slowly. And so I think recognizing that there's a fast pathway and a thorough pathway, and don't mix them up. Because if you respond quickly to something that should have taken more forethought, then that could be bad. And if you wait too long to decide on something that needed an urgent decision, that could also be bad. So I highly recommend that book.
Great recommendation. We appreciate it. What advice would you give leaders who are facing resistance or skepticism from their team members or constituents during a crisis?
So people are very resistant to change. There's this thing called a Kotter, Kotter. I think it's 8 steps to change. We learned about it in business school. I thought it was fascinating because it is hard to change people's mind, their perspective, and that can be fellow commissioners or people in leadership, or it could be the public. One thing I learned from the surgical world, a lot of people, and I do robotic surgery a lot now too, but when the robot first came on the scene in the general surgery space, the company tried to advertise to the doctors, to the surgeons, and they thought, man, we don't need that. I know how to do this already. So the company regrouped and they started pitching it to the patients. And then the patient, just pure advertising. And the patients went to the doctors, and the doctors were like, well, this is what they want. We better start doing it. So I think about that in the public policy space too, is if we can convince the public, once we find out the right answer, we convince the public, which also involves getting their input. And then they'll put the pressure back on the other leaders. But the key there is to have a link between who the leader is and who his constituency is. And I think that's true in business as well. The office politics we deal with, our board is not tied to a certain set of people. It's just a vague board. So there's often people that don't feel like they have a direct representation. And that connection to who your representative is very important. I think in office politics as well as regular politics, because you have to know whose voice, people get frustrated if they don't have a voice and they don't have a choice. And so a lot of these, like when I'm the situations we're navigating right now in the Public Service Commission, is I want to be able to communicate what the issue is, what the problems are, what the potential solutions are, and then why we picked the solution that we did. And it's usually logic based. It's not some emotional like, oh, that one was favorite color. And I think that's important in leadership, is to have a direct connection with the people you feel like you're representing. And because if without that, then you could be on an island that I think could get pretty dangerous.
Absolutely, which follow-up question here. How do you manage the stress and emotional toll that can come with leading in high-stress crisis situations?
Personally, I used to think it was a badge of honor to not sleep very much. I'd only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night because I had so much to do. And the older I get, the more I realize like sleep is very important. And it's harder to do the older you get, but the REM sleep helps with your brain and your thinking, and deep sleep helps with the physical ailments that you have. So that's highly important. It's back to that analogy of if you're on an airplane and it starts to go down, they always tell you to put the oxygen on yourself first before you put it on your child, because if you can't take care of yourself, then you can't be healthy enough to take care of other people. And so that and exercise, I try to, this isn't always doable depending on this, if you're in a certain season of life, but I try to only have one night of meetings a week, because I think being home is super important for me, and it's super important for my marriage and for my children. And that's supposedly why I'm doing all of this. And so it's no sense in letting all of that tank just because I need to do another meeting. Speaking of which, there's a law that I learned in business school that I like a lot. It's called Parkinson's law. And it says that work will adapt to the time allotted for it. So there are people often that'll call and say, hey, can you meet for dinner? And I'll say, how's 6:30 Tuesday morning for 20 minutes? And they go, oh, that'll work. And I have to remember that I might be on the other side of that one day if I'm running for re-election, or if I need something, I might ask for something. They may give me a smaller portion. But it is important, I think, to structure rest and reflection. I do a form of meditation called centering prayer that's very effective. It started with the monks, but it's 20 minutes of absolute silence twice a day. People that meditate have a little more clarity, a little more peace, and can often have fresh perspectives. So I do that. And I'll be honest, I love therapy. I call it a coach. I think about Drew Brees had 3 coaches when he was quarterback of the Saints. For a game they played 17 times a year. Can I have one? And what I like about it is, the guy's he's not a friend. He's a professional. He can see things that I can't, help me understand my blind spots. And I can vomit, I'm really overwhelmed by this, or I'm really frustrated by this. And so I find all of those to be tools to make sure I'm as sharp as possible in a crisis and in everyday life.
Some great wisdom there. Final question for you. What advice would you give to emerging leaders who aspire to be effective crisis leaders in the future?
I would say don't expect to have all the answers when you start. If you want to be the CEO of, I don't know, Exxon or JP Morgan or whatever, you're not going to go from never being a CEO to that. So it's going to start with crisis management on a smaller level that you do well at. And I think it's important to, after each crisis, identify that as a crisis and then go, okay, what did I do well and what could I have done better? And then, make notes of that. And then when you see the next play coming, you can recognize from the play before to say, okay, you know what? That was one of those situations where I wish I would have done something differently. I'm going to do that this time. Or maybe look under that rock or ask that question. So I would not view, Julio, my friend Julio has this thing, IQ is very important, EQ is very important, but FQ is super important, and that's failure quotient. Can you get back up? My grandfather's epitaph says, I might have tried and failed, but I never failed to try. And so I would not, and in our society today, I really feel for the young people, the teenagers, because your failures are all over social media. And so people are, and there's even a book called, I think it's Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, where, sometimes the smart, the highest IQ people wouldn't risk much because they were risking that they were already smart. And so what if a smart person fails? Well, that's where wisdom comes in, is if you can learn from that and not repeat it. One of my favorite quotes is, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. You may ask how I know this. And so wouldn't it be better for me to also learn from others' mistakes so that I would not repeat them as well, right?
Dr. Greene, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. Some great wisdom that you've shared with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Penny.
And thanks also to our viewers for joining us today, as well as our sponsors, the East Baton Rouge Parish Library and Home Bank. Please join us again for the November 15th episode of Strictly Business. Until then, enjoy and make your day a great one.